السلام الأتمان الأكملان الأزكيان الأعطران على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا وأنت تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا سهلا. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وعملا متقبلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين، وبعد، فالسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. So we meet today by the help, the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we are 2 weeks away from Ramadan al-Mubarak. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have us reach it with the best of His blessings subhanahu wa ta'ala, with the tawfiq, with the qabool, with the afiyah, with all health and energy to fast the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to fast. And last year we had similar series, Ramadan Prep. Anyone remembers what we spoke about? So for those who don't remember, go to YouTube, to our channel, and listen to those sessions, because we're not going to repeat them, but it's going to be something different we discussed last time that you will find interesting, inshallah ta'ala, about the taqwa, what happens to your brain in Ramadan, what happens to your physiology in Ramadan, and how that leads to taqwa. Today, inshallah, we're going to talk briefly about the importance of fasting and the best way to achieve Ramadan and the benefits of Ramadan. And it was the habit of the companions, as you know, to live in the spirit of Ramadan. The companions have been reported that they would, when Ramadan comes, they would spend half a year just living the memories of Ramadan, the spirit of Ramadan, remembering the qiyam, remembering the fasting, remembering the blessings of Ramadan. And after half of that year passes by, they start longing and yearning for the coming Ramadan. When is Ramadan gonna come? So they always lived in the spirit of Ramadan, the memories of Ramadan, the blessings of Ramadan. And this is what the Sha'ar said, رمضان عمري كله في ذكركم ما بين إحياء وطي. All my life should be Ramadan in the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because you always fast, remember Ramadan, you always have qiyamul layl and you remember Ramadan. And it was also reported that the Sahaba and the Salaf قالوا كان إذا قدم شعبان أكبوا على القرآن وأخرجوا الزكاة. So it was the habit of the companions and the Salaf, our ancestors, that when Sha'ban comes, they switch on Ramadan mode. So they start reciting the Quran heavily, meaning what we're doing, Ramadan prep, that was a habit of the Sahaba. They start prepping for Ramadan by turning on a different mode. They double their effort even in Sha'ban in reciting the Quran, and then they pay their zakah. Why is that? Number one, so they don't busy themselves during Ramadan with ikhraj zakah, because their mind is free. A lot of people have the habit of spending their zakah in Ramadan. That was not the habit of the Sahaba. So the Sahaba would do it differently. Many of them would do it during the month of Sha'ban. And the second reason is to make sure that the poor people and the needy people have received enough provision prior to the month of Ramadan, so they're not busy during Ramadan working and looking for rizq. So the one who gives is mind free. They don't have to go calculating and going here and there to give it. And the one who receives it, also they're sufficient. They're prepared for Ramadan. So on both ends, everyone enters Ramadan and they are in a state of peace of mind, that they don't have to worry about that. The point is, we're trying to make here that there was such a thing called Ramadan prep. And that prep obviously was the mental state of receiving Ramadan with the highest level of energy, with the anticipation of the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's the first lesson we learn, that the Sahaba, the Salaf, used to be prepared for Ramadan by living the spirit of Ramadan, by also turning on a different mode for Ramadan. The second thing that we need to point out, and this is something we always say, that when Ramadan comes, we need to make sure that this Ramadan is better than Ramadan that passed. Right? Because the mu'min should be always in a state of improvement, increasing, getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It has been reported that Ali bin Abi Talib radiyallahu anhu said, and even some attribute it to the Prophet as a hadith, قال من استوى يومه فهو مغبون. من استوى يومه فهو مغبون. Meaning, if your 2 days, meaning yesterday and today, are equal in your level of knowledge, your position, how close you are to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then you've been cheated on. Al-ghubn is when someone cheats, sells you something worth of $10, sells it to you for $25. So that's ghubn. You're being cheated on. So you're cheating on yourself if your 2 days, meaning yesterday and today, are equal. You missed a huge opportunity. You missed a huge chance to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you did not get the worth of it, the value of it. So that's al-ghubn, right? وَمَنْ كَانَ آخِرُ يَوْمَيْهِ شَرًّا. And if you are getting worse, meaning the 2 days, the second day, the next day is worse than the previous day, قَالَ فَهُوَ مَلْعُونَ. It's a curse from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How do you know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves you, and how do you know that He's letting off of you? If He keeps guiding you to get closer to Him, that's a sign of love to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And how do you love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? By exercising the effort to keep getting closer to Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. قال وَمَنْ لَمْ يَكُنْ فِي زِيَادَةٍ فَهُوَ فِي نُقْصَانٍ. And if a person is not increasing in their deeds, in their iman, in their connectedness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then there is no status quo. You're either increasing or you're regressing. You're going backward, right? Because with the passage of time, if you're at the same position and time is passing, that means you're decreasing, because you should be increasing with time, right? If you're filling water and your water is the same, what does that mean? Some others are increasing and you're at the same position, that's you're decreasing. قال ومن كان في نقصان, and whoever is regressing and decreasing, what does that, what's better for him? قال فالموت خير له. Then death is better for him because you don't want to be decreasing, right? So the value of this life, according to Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu wa arda, that you are always in a state of improvement, bettering yourself, increasing your iman, getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as we mentioned, the blessing of this life, what is the blessing of this life? خيركم من طال عمره وحسن عمله. The best of you are those who have the long life, but with a condition that their deeds are excellent as well. Right? So every day you gain is a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You have to fill it with deeds. You have to fill it with what gets you the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what increases your level of in Jannah. And we mentioned, if you remember the hadith, anyone remembers the hadith that I'm going to talk about? The story when the companion Ubay radiallahu anhu saw the dream, right? He saw the dream. There were two companions who embraced Islam, accepted Islam at the same time, right? And then they were equal in their effort to, in their salah, in their fasting. And then one of them was martyred, right? Shahada, which is one of the biggest honors that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can bestow and confer upon a person. And then his friend outlived him a whole year, right? And then they both died, and Ubay saw a dream that in the day of judgment, the one who died naturally, was not martyred, was in a much higher position than the martyr, right? And then he wanted to come and he said, your turn is not here. You're still alive. Your books have not been sealed. So then he came to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, and everyone was in a state of astonishment. Everyone was in a state of shock, surprised. How could the normal person have a much higher position than the shaheed? Right? So the Prophet ﷺ said, are you surprised? And he outlived him a whole year and fasted a whole month of Ramadan. That's the point. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed him to fast this much and much of Ramadan, and then he prayed this many and many of Salah. 355 days times 5, how much? 1700 something salah. And he had, of course, the intention to die as a martyr. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him that reward for the intention and elevated his level by the deeds. So every day you open your eyes in the morning, you see it as a blessing because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you this opportunity to get closer to Him subhanahu wa ta'ala, to remember Him, and to have more deeds. What were the words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam when he opens his day, opens his eyes? What was his dhikr, his supplication? Alhamdulillahi alladhi radda ilayya ruhi wa adhina li bidhikrih. Subhanallah. الحمد لله الذي رد إلي روحي وأذن لي بذكره. Thanking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for giving him his soul back, and what gave me the honor, the permission to remember him once again. That is the blessing of the day, that you are able to worship Him subhanahu wa ta'ala, you are able to connect with Him, to remember Him subhanahu wa ta'ala through the deeds. And of course, then comes the health and the wealth and everything else that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has bestowed upon you. So that is a day to thank Allah for, that is a day to consume in the ta'ah of Allah, in the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is a day to get closer, right? قل بفضل الله وبرحمته فبذلك فليفرحوا هو خير مما يجمعون. Right? So say, it is by the grace, by the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For that, let them rejoice. It's better than what they hoard. What they hoard, assets, wealth, and this and that, cars, properties, that is not something that's gonna benefit you unless you use for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The rahmah, the grace of Allah is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you to get closer to Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? الدنيا ملعونة ملعون ما فيها إلا ذكر الله وما والاه أو عالما ومتعلما. The dunya, this whole world is cursed, and everything in it is cursed except the remembrance of Allah. وَمَا وَلَا, anything that associated with it, meaning gets you there, closer to Allah, remembering Allah, or someone is seeking knowledge, or someone is teaching the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As we mentioned before in another story, that when Umar radiallahu anhu was with his servant once, got the spoils of يعني الغنائم من الكوفة, من العراق. There were a lot of camels, and Umar and his servant were just touring around. See, there were like tons of them, hundreds, mashallah. And Umar was wiping on the camels and was pleased. And the servant wanted to impress Umar and said, قل بفضل الله وبرحمته فليفرحوا هو خير مما يجمعون. Let him rejoice by the grace and mercy of Allah. So what did Umar say? Said, no, this is mimma yajma'un. This is what you hoard for the dunya. The blessings of Allah is not this. Although this was from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, came without seeking it. But that shows you the philosophy, the mentality of the Sahaba. This is dunya. The dunya is anything that takes you away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the akhirah, everything that gets you closer and make you remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is how you judge your day. A day you wake up for Fajr, you come for Jama'ah, is a blessed day because you opened it with the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A day you prayed all your fara'id is a day worth of living because it got you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A day with a sin is a day to regret. A day of ghafla, of oblivion, of heedlessness is a day to regret, to have remorse on. قال ليس يتحسر أهل الجنة على شيء يوم القيامة. The people in Jannah would not regret anything in the day of judgment. إلا على ساعة مرت في الدنيا لم يذكروا الله فيها. They regret nothing because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives them everything in the Jannah. The only thing they would have remorse for and regret, a time in the dunya passes by without the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because they realize how easy it was and how massive and tremendous the reward would be in the day of judgment. So they would say, I wish. So now you have that opportunity, you have that time to busy your time to spend it in the ta'ah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the point is, with this whole introduction, we want to make sure that every day comes is better than yesterday. Right? Better than the previous day. And every Ramadan that comes is better than the previous Ramadan. And how do we judge how better it is? It is better in taqwa. For Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned, يا أيها الناس كتب عليكم الصيام كما كتب على الذين من قبلكم لعلكم تتقون. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has ordained the month of Ramadan, and the month of Ramadan with its siyam, with its qiyam, with adhkar, with ta'ah, so you may achieve piety. Right? So that means the piety you have to achieve has to be also increasing, because we don't want to make 2 days equal. Every day has to be better than before, and every Ramadan has to be better than the one before, right? And as we recited in Isha, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not only make the fasting a method or a path for us to achieve the taqwa, all the ibadah are meant as a vehicle to achieve the taqwa. يا أيها الناس اعبدوا ربكم الذي خلقكم والذين من قبلكم لعلكم تتقون. Worship Allah so you may achieve taqwa. And that is the central point around which all our activities revolve, achieving the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we mentioned, and I advise you to listen to the lecture from last year because we spoke in details what taqwa means. But the taqwa is that spontaneous inclination that pulls you towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spontaneously and pulls you away from anything that displeases Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is how you measure your taqwa. And we mentioned exactly how you can measure your taqwa, and you score yourself to compare yourself. Put it on a calendar, and after a year when Ramadan comes, see, where am I today? What did I do with my heart? Because the taqwa ها هنا, right? The Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام said, التقوى ها هنا ويشير إلى صدره. The taqwa resides here, and he points to his chest, meaning to his heart, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So what did you do with your heart? Did you protect it? Did you present it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Or did you hand it to the shaitan to do with it whatever the shaitan wants and to whisper into it what it wants? Or did you protect it and guard it and observed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so nothing comes to this heart but what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants and pleases? It's been half hour, so we're going to stop here bi'iznillahi ta'ala, and next halaqah to be continued on achieving the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and making Ramadan different. اللهم اغفر ذنوبنا واستر عيوبنا واقض حوائجنا وتقبل أعمالنا. اللهم بلغنا رمضان وتسلمه منا متقبلا، وأعنا فيه على الصيام والقيام وغض البصر وحفظ اللسان، وأدخلنا الجنة بسلام. اللهم وفرج عن المسلمين في مشارق الأرض ومغاربها، وخصوصا عن أهلنا في بلاد الشام وفلسطين. اللهم أتمم لأهل الشام نورهم وفتحهم ونصرهم. اللهم وهيئ لهذه الأمة أمر رشد يعز به أهل طاعتك ويذل به أهل معصيتك، ويؤمر فيه بالمعروف وينهى فيه عن المنكر، ويذكر فيه اسمك ويحكم فيه بشرعك، وتنصر به سنة نبيك محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. آمين آمين آمين. والله يقول الحق وهو يهدي السبيل. وجزاكم الله خيرا، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.